A warning for listeners that this series contains graphic details, including references to murder and rape. A killer had been walking free for a month, and then that month turned into a year. 1 year became 10, then 20, then 30, 40, almost 50. Whoever had murdered Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett was still at large, likely growing old and living life after stealing theirs so violently. Some wouldn't live long enough to see justice done for the two Sues. Those still waiting mightn't have realised it, but the wheels of justice were turning. Turning slowly and behind the scenes, but turning nonetheless. A list of more than 130 potential killers had been whittled down, and after breakthroughs in DNA, investigators were about to set their sights on one man. My name is Olivia Jenkins, and I'm a crime reporter at the Herald Sun. And this is Hunting Justice, the Easey Street murders. The deep dive into one of Australia's most brutal cold cases, and the man police now allege is at the centre of it all. A year after Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were murdered in their Easey Street home, homicide detectives hadn't been able to pin down their killer. Sue Armstrong's new boyfriend, Barry Woodard, and his brother Henry had been questioned repeatedly, and for a while there, detectives had their sights set on Sue Bartlett's new suitor, Ross Hammond. He had apparently looked rather nervous and sweaty, as one detective put it, when police probed him over the murders in Elstonwick, where we believe he may have lived. But as those leads went nowhere, the Sue's families were getting desperate for answers. Suzanne's sister Gail even spoke with British medium Doris Stokes in a meeting organised by the Sunday Press. But nothing came of Mrs. Stokes' out there speculations, and the homicide squad was not particularly happy about the meeting, saying they were, quote, concerned with the natural, not the supernatural. Instead, police hoped a cash incentive would generate more tips that could lead them to the killer.
Senior police in Melbourne are considering asking the state government to post a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the Easey Street sex killer.
Life on Easey Street seemed to move on around the so-called murder house. Neighbours came and went, and homicide detectives quickly became overwhelmed by a spate of more recent murders that moved higher up on the list of cases to solve.
A grieving son is pleading for the public's help to find his mother's killer. Mary Ann Fagan was stabbed to death in her Armidale home 46 years ago. Her son Patrick...
The following year, on February 17, 41-year-old mother of 5, Mary Ann Fagan was bound, gagged and stabbed to death while her children were at school. A month later, an unknown killer gunned down 3 men during a robbery at a Melbourne jeweller's office. And just a week after that, 13-year-old Denise McGregor's body was found by the side of the road after she vanished from a Coburg hamburger shop. And then, in 1982, mother of 4 Jenny Rose Ung was stabbed to death inside her Richmond public housing flat. All of those murders remain unsolved today. Back in Collingwood, time was not on the side of detectives. The investigation into the Easey Street killings had stalled, and there were still no answers for the two Sue's families by the time another wave of high-profile crimes rocked Melbourne in the mid-80s, just streets away from where Susan and Suzanne were murdered. A decade later, and just a few blocks away from Easey Street, Julian Knight would carry out the Hoddle Street massacre, killing 7 people and wounding 19 others. And a few months later, 22-year-old Frank Vitkovic would open fire on workers inside the Australia Post offices on Queen Street in Melbourne CBD, killing 8 people before he fell to his death. The lack of answers followed their friend Neville Webster all through university.
You'd go to the Royal Hotel or something and you'd see half the school staff. And, we'd talk about a whole range of things, but this is one of the topics that used to come up, and how bad it was and whoever gets resolved.
And while the investigation dragged on, more tragedy followed for both the Armstrong and Bartlett families. Some of them wouldn't survive long enough to see any breakthroughs in the case. First, Susan Bartlett's father Clifford died just 2 weeks after his daughter's murder. Then, a year later, tragedy would strike Suzanne's father, Bill. Here's crime writer Andrew Rule.
Mr Armstrong, he split up with his wife later, and he went to Bairnsdale in Gippsland, and he was killed fighting a big grass fire up there. He perished fighting a fire in only a couple of years after his daughter's murder. So, tragic story, tragic family. A family touched by tragedy.
Susan's mother, Elaine, died a few years after Bill in 1982. And in 2002, Suzanne's brother Terry died in a house fire. Sue Bartlett's brother Martin told author Helen Thomas that their mother just couldn't cope with his sister's murder. We've used a voice actor to bring Martin Bartlett's words to life here.
For her to understand why someone would do it, and to do it to her daughter, really, just over the years, her blood pressure went through the roof. She died at 61. It just killed her in the end. It was such a stressful thing that she never, ever came to grips with why someone would do it. Even if they had found somebody, she wouldn't have comprehended why that person could have done what they did.
Suzanne's mother, Eileen, lived long enough for homicide detectives to boost the reward for information about the girls' murders to $1 million in 2017, before she too died in October in 2021. This was their family's emotional plea for anyone who knew something to finally come forward.
You can live the rest of your life in comfort. Say something.
The house in Easey Street that had become synonymous with the brutal murders had moved on too, in a way. It was sold for the first time since Susan and Suzanne's death in 1983, and it has changed hands several times since then. And baby Gregory, the little one who had somehow escaped the same brutal death as his mother and her best friend in that house, was all grown up. After the murders, Suzanne's sister Gail took him in and raised him, all while juggling life as the new mum of her own baby. Greg was eventually able to track down his father, the Greek man that Suzanne Armstrong had met during her travels, with the help of the late author and respected Sun News journalist Tom Pryor. In 1996, he published the first in-depth look at the murders, They Trusted Men. And if you remember from earlier, it was that book that had also zeroed in, quite harshly, on the girls' rumoured promiscuity. Here's fellow author Helen Thomas.
Attitudes change, cultural sort of perspective changes, policing techniques change, their tools have changed. But still, even though we can be, critical, we even though we can offer that critique and have a different perspective, I still think we have to remember that, those detectives would have cared very deeply about what had happened to those women.
And it would be almost 2 decades after the murders before crime scene evidence would start to yield anything useful for investigators.
In fairness to the police, we have to say, in those days, they didn't have the scientific tools, if you like, the tools of detection that they now have. They didn't have DNA, and that's a pretty big thing not to have. So they were working with blood analysis, they were working with fingerprints, and no matter what, when you look back, if there was, and also I guess we need to sort of remind ourselves too that there was no CCTV footage, there were no mobile phones, there was not the way people are tracked now, people and times can be looked at, if you like, in a visual way. Most of us don't know how often we're being filmed all the time, as we go in and out of not just shops and sort of malls, but also some apartment blocks and even private homes now.
DNA evidence wasn't used for the first time in an Australian court until 1989, more than a decade after the murders. And until 1998, when a new round of DNA testing on the evidence in the case began, pretty much all investigators could gather from the blood samples from the crime scene was that Susan was O blood type and Suzanne was A. Back in episode 3, we took you through a whole range of other items police and forensics collected at the crime scene. The patch of carpet, a sperm sample that was collected from Sue Armstrong's body, blood scrapings from a wall in the hallway, and a lamp. Though they'd sat in storage for decades, and they were moved from one place to the next, That breakthrough in the late 90s meant they could all of a sudden tell detectives much more about the horror Susan and Suzanne suffered, and maybe even who had unleashed it on them.
So I have a PhD in molecular biology, so since graduating I've worked mainly in the DNA lab space in different areas, and turning to forensics in 2008.
That's Dr. Dadna Hartman. She's a molecular biologist and the manager of the DNA lab at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. We've asked her for her expert insights into how DNA actually works, what it tells us about a crime scene and a potential killer. Dadna's not referring to specific evidence in the Easey Street case here, but she's giving us a general breakdown of how DNA can shape an investigation.
DNA is a chemical that we all carry and we can leave behind. It can be recovered from things like bloodstains in some criminal matters, or touching an object. From a deceased point of view, we can recover DNA from post-mortem samples such as tissue, blood, bone. So really it's the DNA's biological material that can be extracted from these sorts of samples and used in helping to either identify a person or determine whether the samples could have originated from the same donor, or to help us in determining whether people are biologically related.
Forensic specialists were finally able to lift some of that DNA from vaginal swabs taken from Suzanne Armstrong and extract what they called a partial DNA profile, one that might have belonged to the killer. But what exactly is a partial profile, and what could it tell investigators?
The more markers that you have DNA information for and able to be compared, then the more strength that profile has in being able to give you a strong comparison. There have been increases or improvements in the kits that we use. So let's say even 10 or 15 years ago, the number of markers that we analysed were fewer. You needed a lot more DNA to do the analysis. Therefore, sometimes you weren't able to perform that analysis because you didn't have enough DNA, or the DNA was inhibited, or there was another issue. The kits that we have now are more tolerant towards the inhibitors. You'll need less DNA to be able to get a profile, and we're looking at a lot more markers of DNA. So here at the Institute, we use a kit that looks at 21 markers. So we're able to get a lot more DNA information from those samples than we did just a few years ago.
And with a list of suspects that had ballooned to more than 130 persons of interest, could that partial profile be used to eliminate some of them too?
We don't look at all of your DNA. We look at a number of markers that are very specific for identification purposes and are valuable in that respect. And we look at a set of those markers, and it's a combination of that analysis that yields what is known as a DNA profile. And once we have that DNA profile, we can say, based on that DNA data, does it support the proposition that these two individuals could be biologically related, or that these samples have originated from the same person? And the way we express that is in a likelihood value. So what is the likelihood that these two people are related as opposed to two people at random from the population? Or what is the likelihood that this sample has originated from this donor as opposed to not? And that can be expressed as a figure, and it's usually, for a criminal case, it could be quite a large number that gets expressed, trillion times more likely. From an ID point of view, could be 10 million times more likely that these two people are related.
And when forensic specialists extracted the partial DNA profile of the potential killer, that giant list was looking a lot smaller. Detectives say they had narrowed it down to just 8 men. The man once at the top of that list, colourful crime journalist John Grant, had been cleared, according to police, and so had race car driver Peter Brock. They'd also shifted their focus away from other men you've heard about, away from the dodgy ex-cop Ian Lloyd, as well as Peter Sampsonidis. Barry and Henry also didn't seem to fit the profile, and neither did Ross Hammond, Sue Bartlett's new boyfriend. Detectives at one stage also flew to the UK to compare that partial DNA profile with another man, but they weren't a match either. Detectives were armed with a whole pool of suspects, and DNA they thought might belong to the killer. But still, all of those clues hadn't offered up any sort of match. But they hadn't given up. He didn't know it then, but when Ron Iddles grabbed that knife off 17-year-old Perry all those years ago, it was only his first brush with the case. By the time he became a respected and high-profile homicide detective, the mammoth hunt for the Sue's killers had transformed into one of Australia's most chilling unsolved cases. One that had somehow seemed to have so many leads, but so few answers. Detective Iddles had closed more than 300 investigations, but Easey Street wasn't one of them. But the knife Iddles seized from Perry had remained a point of interest for investigators and forensic specialists throughout the investigation. The blade, the one that Perry said he found on the train tracks, was held in a sheath, a sort of fitted protective cover. Early media reports had suggested the knife had been wiped clean and that its brown plastic handle contained some blood samples. But they could only point to Group A blood, Suzanne Armstrong's blood type, and a fairly common one, but no trace of Sue Bartlett's Group O blood type. One inspector in the days after the killings discounted the knife because it had been found, quote, too soon after the murders. But that same knife was plastered on the front page of the Herald with the headline, "Did this kill 2 girls?" Forensic biologists retested the knife in 1998 and again in 2018 and 2019. This time, no blood was detected on the knife or its sheath, but one sample on its blade turned up a, quote, very partial profile. But that was too small to be compared to anything. And so, a pathologist believed that the knife could neither be ruled in or out as the murder weapon. Detectives had also visited another man at the request of the homicide squad about a knife that might have been kept at his house. But Perry Karumblis's committal hearing heard that police didn't seize that one because they believed it was too big to have caused the stab wounds found on the Sue's bodies. The years ticked by until Detective Iddles quietly reopened the Easey Street investigation in 2011. Then, in 2012, DNA from those same 8 original key suspects was retested in the hopes it might give investigators new clues. But again, they weren't a match. And what had happened to that young Sharpie, Perry Karumblis?
I never found anything wrong with him. He was a bit of an eccentric in that he was a bit of a loner. He had friends. He had friends that would drop in from time to time. Not a huge number of friends. He and I got on well. He did spend a lot of time during the summer months going out fishing out in Port Phillip Bay. He'd always catch his limit out there. He was a good fisherman. And we just sort of chatted because we were neighbours,
You just heard from Phil Akers. He was once pretty good friends with him. I first tracked Phil down in late 2024 while I was trying to learn everything I could about Perry. Their friendship started in Melbourne's outer suburbs, but this time Phil's chatting to me from Broome in far northwestern Australia. We're FaceTiming over a shaky connection as he and his wife tour all around the Australian outback.
I had a factory in Denham South. Perry bought the factory next door. And I'm not sure the exact date, but it could be around 2006, there on about. I'm not sure of the exact date. We got to know him because he was a next door neighbour at the factory.
Most of what I've been able to learn about Perry and his family picks up from the 2000s because he pretty much stayed off the radar until then. His parents eventually left the Karumblis family home in Bendigo Street in Collingwood and went back to their native Greece. He was 17 years old when the Sues were killed and likely got into Melbourne's Sharpie scene for a little while, if Kate Buck's memory of him in episode 2 is anything to go by. Andreas, one of Perry's brothers, went back to Greece too, and he lives in Athens now. But Perry and his other brother Tony stayed in Melbourne. And it sounds like Perry led a pretty simple life.
He was a sociable sort of guy. he spent a lot of time working on it by himself. He would obviously go out fishing by himself at times. We went out a couple of times together. He had some friends that I met, and they seemed to all I can't remember their names or anything, but guys that were just knockabout sort of blokes that you could meet anywhere.
Perry had become a welder, and he'd often make rod fences for clients from that factory in Dandenong. And when he wasn't working or fishing, he'd be working on his own DIY projects.
He had a motorbike and a car towards the end of, I'm not sure the exact date, but around 2015, he bought an old school bus and was converting it into a motorhome.
And Phil says it wasn't unusual for Perry to travel back to Greece to see his family. By 2015, his mother wasn't doing too well.
He would go every now and then, go over to Greece to visit his mother, who was sick. Apparently, the government after the Second World War had an arrangement that the Greek people came here, they would get their pension if they go back to Greece. Perry used to go over, as I said, to look after her for a few weeks at a time. And then she got ill, and that's when, to my knowledge, that's when he left to go over there and look after her while she was badly ill.
Phil didn't realise it, but just a couple of years later, he'd be seeing his fishing buddy Perry for what would turn out to be the last time.
He just said he was going to Greece to see his mother, and at that stage, nothing was permanent. It was just another trip over to Greece. And then in our communications, he said that she was pretty well and he's going to stay there.
In the next episode of Hunting Justice.
I was in my apartment in Glen Waverley, and when it came on the news, and it near knocked me off the bloody couch, I was dumbfounded.